The galactic peace convoy buzzed with activity as dozens of diplomatic ships from different star empires arrived at the neutral docking station above the planet Ulverus Prime, where the Great Summit would begin to settle years of border disputes and cold wars. Security was tight, and the atmosphere was tense as representatives of the Thalzer Empire, the Icaran Hive, and the Varad Coalition all prepared to meet face-to-face after decades of distrust. But a wave of confusion spread through the council chamber when word came that Princess Kalari, the sole heir of the Thalzer throne, had refused to board any of the Empire's royal vessels. She declined Icaran transports, Varad cruisers, and even the Council's own high-security envoy ship. Her demand was simple but shocking. She would only travel aboard a human vessel, specifically a ship named the Valiant Rose, commanded by Captain Elias Munro of the United Earth Fleet. The request confused everyone, especially since humanity was the youngest race in the galaxy, barely a few decades into space travel, known more for their chaotic creativity than refined diplomacy. Many council members protested, calling it a stunt or a ploy, but Kalari was unmoved. Her tone was cold, her posture regal, and she refused to explain herself. The humans were contacted immediately, and Captain Monroe, in the middle of a routine patrol near the asteroid colony of Stratus 9, was given direct orders from Earth Command to halt operations and reroute to Ulverus, primed to accept the Thalzer Princess on board. Elias Munro, a war veteran with calm eyes and a sharp mind, didn't like surprises, especially ones wrapped in royal ceremony and politics, but orders were orders. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why would an alien royal trust a human ship over her own? Humans weren't known for their luxury, and the Valiant Rose was a mid-class tactical vessel, not a luxury cruiser. Its crew was trained, but not used to carrying dignitaries, let alone someone with enough status to start or stop a war. As the docking procedure began, Monroe stood in the bay with his second-in-command, Lieutenant Ava Chun, watching as the silver transport pod approached and latched onto the airlock. When the doors opened, Princess Kalari stepped out, surrounded by 3 silent bodyguards in shimmering armor. Her presence was sharp and commanding tall, silver-skinned, with glowing violet eyes and a layered royal cloak that seemed too elegant for the metal corridors of a military vessel. She offered Monroe a small nod, then walked past without a word, as if she had just stepped into her own palace. Monroe raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, giving the silent signal to Chun to scan for anything suspicious. The guards followed the princess closely, all carrying diplomatic IDs, but one of them, Monroe noticed, kept glancing at the bulkheads, as if mapping the ship's layout. Kalari requested her quarters be on a deck close to the bridge, away from engineering and cargo, which was unusual for a dignitary. Monroe didn't argue, but had internal alarms going off. Over the next few hours, the crew did their best to make the alien passengers comfortable, but something felt strange. Kalari rarely spoke and avoided standard diplomatic greetings. She didn't request any food, didn't ask about ship status, and spent most of her time alone in her quarters. Her guards never relaxed, and one was caught trying to enter a restricted maintenance corridor before Chun redirected him with a sharp warning. Monroe began to suspect that Kalari wasn't just being stubborn or difficult. She was afraid of something. When Monroe asked her directly, she simply replied, "I trust this ship. That is all you need to know." That answer didn't sit well with him, but with the summit deadline approaching, he had little choice but to comply. As the final pre-launch checks began, Monroe reviewed the engineering report and found something odd. A discrepancy in the power grid calibration logs. A backup control circuit in the propulsion system had been rerouted just 2 hours earlier, and no one had signed off on it. That was impossible. His crew followed strict procedure, and he knew every one of them by name. Digging deeper, he found that the change would have caused a false diagnostic during the jump sequence, making it appear as though the ship was fully operational, when in fact the navigation relay would have failed mid-jump, stranding them in deep space with no course correction. Monroe immediately locked down engineering and called a quiet alert to senior officers, instructing them to search for signs of tampering. He walked back into the corridor near the princess's quarters, his mind racing. Someone had tried to sabotage the Valiant Rose before it even left dock, but who, and more importantly, why? As he stood there, he realized the answer might be walking right under his command, hidden behind royal titles and diplomatic masks. With one eye on the dark corners of his own ship and the other on the silent alien princess who refused to travel with anyone else, Monroe knew one thing for sure. This mission was about more than diplomacy. And if someone was willing to risk lives before they even launched, then the real danger was only just beginning. The engines of the Valiant Rose hummed softly as the ship moved into mid-warp, gliding through the dark stretch of space with purpose. Yet the mood aboard was anything but calm. After the discovery of sabotage, Captain Monroe quietly increased internal scans and tightened access protocols, but he kept it out of the daily briefings to avoid stirring panic among the crew. Only a handful of officers knew the truth, and even they were unsure who to trust, especially with an alien princess and her guards on board. Kelari remained distant, mostly staying within her quarters or the observation deck, rarely speaking unless spoken to, but Monroe began to notice how often she ended up near him, whether in the command corridor, the mess hall, or even the training simulator room. She never admitted she was following him, but her questions always drifted back to human behavior, to what humans believed in and how they handled betrayal. At first, Monroe gave careful, formal answers, but as the hours passed and the mystery of the sabotage lingered, he allowed his curiosity to meet hers. One evening, she asked him why humans were not more involved in galactic politics, and when he answered with a shrug, she gave a small smile and said, "That's why I trust your kind. You're too new to be corrupted." That sentence stuck with Monroe like a cold echo. Later, in a quiet moment away from the bridge, Kalari finally confessed what Monroe had begun to suspect. Someone wanted her dead. Not just any enemy, but someone within her own empire. She explained how in the past month, her personal cruiser had experienced a hull breach near the border zone, and just 2 weeks ago, her shuttle's oxygen systems had failed minutes after takeoff. Both attacks had been labeled accidents by her advisors, but she had stopped believing in coincidence. The Thalzer Empire, proud and powerful, was beginning to fracture under political pressure, and Kalari had become both symbol and target. She told Monroe that human ships had a reputation for being harder to infiltrate with the tech most common in the galaxy, especially mind-altering devices and loyalty implants. Humanity's brains, it seemed, didn't respond like the others, and their systems were annoyingly unpredictable to outside control. That rumor alone had made her choose this ship. Monroe listened, but didn't let down his guard. While her story sounded honest, he couldn't help but think she might be using his crew as a living shield, wrapping herself in the flag of Earth to avoid being assassinated before the summit. Still, he couldn't ignore her eyes when she spoke. Of betrayal. They weren't cold like before. They were tired, searching for something, maybe help, maybe understanding. The situation escalated during a mid-warp drill, meant to test the ship's emergency response systems. It was standard protocol. Lights dimmed, security doors locked, and fake alerts were sent to key departments. But 10 minutes into the exercise, an actual warning triggered in the weapons control room. Someone had tried to access missile launch protocols using a forged identity that appeared, at first glance, to be from a human crew member. The system flagged the error and shut down automatically, but the attempt was too precise to be random. Monroe canceled the drill and ordered a full lockdown of the armory. The crew responded fast, but confusion spread, especially when it was revealed that one of Kalari's guards was unaccounted for. Her chief bodyguard, known as Ralvin, hadn't checked in with internal tracking since the drill began, and his communicator had gone offline. Monroe's command staff initiated a search protocol, combing through every deck and crawl space. Kalari seemed disturbed, but strangely quiet, pacing alone in the observation deck when Monroe found her. She stared at the swirling stars outside. The window, her reflection flickering against the glass like a shadow in motion. Monroe stepped beside her, speaking softly but firmly. "One of your guards is missing. Someone tried to breach our weapons systems. I need answers." Kalari didn't look at him immediately. When she did, her voice was low. "If Ralvin is missing, then someone else is wearing his face." Monroe didn't react outwardly, but inside, a chill ran down his spine. "Explain," he said, his tone sharpening. Kalari turned fully now, her expression no longer calm, but filled with something between fear and anger. "There are factions within my empire that don't want peace. They believe war is the only way to keep our bloodlines strong. Some have access to advanced tech-cloaking suits, identity masks, even partial shapeshifting. If Ralvin is gone, then one of them has boarded the ship in his place." Monroe stared at her, connecting the dots. The sabotage before launch, the strange guard movements, the restricted access attempt, all of it pointed to an infiltrator hiding in plain sight. He realized the entire mission had turned into a deadly game of deception, and the stakes were far higher than he'd been told. With a quiet command into his comms, he ordered a full bioscan of the ship to compare current crew vitals against original boarding records. Then he looked Kalari in the eye and asked the question he had been holding back since the moment she stepped aboard. "Who exactly did you bring onto my ship, and which one of them isn't who they say they are?" The question hung in the air like a blade, sharp and waiting to fall. As the stars outside the window spun quietly through the dark silence of space. Captain Monroe stood in silence for a moment after Kalari's quiet confession, his eyes fixed on her with a new understanding that was quickly drowned by urgency. She had confirmed it. One of the guards was never hers to begin with, an assassin in disguise, likely a shapeshifter trained by the rogue Thalzer faction that rejected the peace process. That faction had been growing quietly for years, feeding off fear and pride, and now they had managed to smuggle a killer onto his ship. Monroe acted quickly, locking down the entire vessel with a priority override, sealing off corridors and activating internal security bots to patrol key access points. A full room-by-room sweep began, but with over 70 compartments and countless maintenance shafts, the search would take precious time. The crew, already rattled by the earlier sabotage and the princess's mysterious behavior, now found themselves caught in the heart of a deadly political storm. Some muttered in frustration, wondering why Earth had accepted such a risky assignment in the first place. A few even whispered doubts about Monroe's leadership, asking if protecting an alien princes was worth risking their own lives. But Monroe didn't flinch. He had seen enough war to know that fear spread faster than facts, and leadership meant holding the line even when the mission got personal. As the security team spread across the ship, Monroe returned to the command deck where Kalari waited, unusually quiet. After a pause, she spoke not with her usual formal tone, but with something softer, almost human. She told Monroe that she had studied Earth's history, from ancient wars to modern diplomacy, and what surprised her most wasn't the technology or speed of development, but the way humans protected each other, not just royalty or soldiers, but ordinary people. In a galaxy full of races that served power or followed bloodlines, humans fought for each other, for families, for friendships, for principles. That kind of loyalty was rare, and it was why she had chosen to place her trust in Monroe's ship. even when others called her foolish. Her voice trembled slightly as she admitted that she had no one else she could trust. And though Monroe still kept his guard up, a part of him began to understand that this mission was more than politics. It was survival. Just then, a distress call crackled through the ship's alert system. Engineering had been hit. Monroe rushed down with his security team and found the place in chaos panels ripped open, emergency lights flashing red, and 2 technicians wounded, 1 unconscious. The attacker had been disguised as a human engineer, wearing a stolen uniform and using a voice modulation chip to pass undetected. If one of the technicians hadn't seen the imposter tampering with the coolant control system, the entire drive core could have gone critical. Monroe's team fired on sight, but the assassin was fast, dodging through the shadows and smoke before slipping into the ventilation system that ran through the ship like a hidden web. Tracking him was nearly impossible. The tunnels were narrow, unlit, and twisted through power conduits and maintenance shafts. But worse news followed within minutes. The assassin wasn't trying to escape. He was heading toward the ships. AI Core, the heart of the Valiant Rose, which controlled everything from navigation to life support. If it was destroyed, the ship would become dead metal drifting in space. The AI, a calm female voice named Lyra, suddenly broke through the comms. "Captain, unauthorized breach detected in Corridor 7 Alpha. If access to core system is not denied within 15 minutes, ship-wide failure is projected. Primary oxygen and directional control will be lost." The announcement sent a chill through every deck. Monroe ordered emergency teams to intercept, but the assassin was too deep, too fast, and the ship's security drones were programmed not to fire in AI-protected zones without direct orders. Before anyone could stop her, Kalari stepped forward and volunteered to help. Monroe protested at first. This wasn't her fight, and her safety was still a diplomatic priority, but she stood firm. She explained that the assassin was one of her people, trained in the same tactical academies, and if anyone could predict his path or thinking, it was her. After a short debate, Monroe relented, assigning her to his squad as they moved through the access corridors toward the AI chamber. The narrow metal passages were hot and silent, lit only by emergency glow strips. Every creak and echo made the crew tense. Monroe led from the front, Kalari close behind, her long cloak now replaced with a fitted combat vest lent by the ship's quartermaster. They passed shattered grates and slashed wires, signs of the assassin's trail. At one junction, Monroe found a security bot smashed beyond repair, and for a moment he feared what they might find ahead. Kalari, scanning the floor, pointed to faint blood traces and said softly, "He's wounded, but not enough to stop him." The minutes ticked by fast. LIRA's voice returned, now louder. "Captain, 10 minutes remain before containment fails. Recommend immediate action." Monroe signaled his team to spread into flanking positions. He knew they were close. Somewhere in the shadows ahead, a killer moved with silent purpose, trying to finish the job before anyone could stop him. And as Monroe's grip tightened on his sidearm, the weight of Kalari's presence behind him reminded him this wasn't just about one ship anymore. It was about trust between 2 worlds, and whether humanity was ready to prove it deserved. That trust. The countdown had begun, and there was no turning back. Captain Monroe moved through the narrow, dimly lit maintenance decks with Kalari close behind, both of them armed, alert, and breathing heavy in the heat and smoke that filled the tunnels. The air was thick with the sharp scent of plasma leaks, and every few steps they had to duck low-hanging pipes or avoid pools of coolant spilling from damaged conduits. Fire suppression systems hissed overhead, randomly bursting into action with freezing mist or chemical foam, making visibility worse. The ship's automated defenses had locked the area down after the breach alert, and now the very systems meant to protect them or turning the decks into a maze of danger. Monroe led the way with calm focus, knowing time was against them, while Kalari followed in silence, her sharp eyes scanning each corner, every flicker of movement. Between each tense moment, they spoke in short, meaningful bursts about leadership, pressure, and the loneliness that came with command. Monroe confessed how hard it was to make decisions that put lives at risk, and Kalari, her voice steady despite the chaos, revealed a deeper truth. She wasn't just a royal figure or ceremonial leader, she was the last surviving heir of the Falzer bloodline. The rest of her family had died over the years, some from natural causes, others from political sabotage disguised as illness or accident. If she died on this mission, there would be no one left to stop the empire from splitting apart, and civil war would follow, tearing the Falzer systems into pieces. Monroe didn't respond with sympathy, only a firm nod. He understood what it meant to carry the weight of a future on his shoulders. Just ahead, the maintenance corridor opened into a circular chamber that housed the ship's central AI relay. Monroe motioned for Kalari to cover him as he crept forward. Sparks rained from exposed wires, and the hum of the AI core grew louder, almost like a heartbeat. Suddenly, a figure moved behind the access panel fast and low, trying to bypass the security grid. Monroe fired a warning shot, and the assassin turned, hissing through a modulator mask. It wasn't the Falzer guard anymore. It was a different form now, a hybrid face shifting between alien features. The assassin spoke, quickly, not with fear, but pride, claiming that he was only part of the plan. There was another ship, cloaked and following the valiant Rose through warp space, waiting for the core systems to go down. Once disabled, the assassin's allies would board, kill Kalari, and erase the last hope for peace. Monroe lunged forward. As the assassin pulled a detonator, and the two struggled near the relay controls, metal scraping, energy flashing around them. Kalari fired, missing the assassin by inches, but forcing him to break the fight and flee down the shaft again. Monroe didn't chase. There wasn't time. He turned to the AI panel, hands moving fast to override the sabotage protocols. Wires had been rerouted, triggers placed to destroy key command circuits. Kalari watched as Monroe worked without hesitation, sweat on his brow and sparks dancing near his fingers. With only seconds to spare, Monroe pulled the final override and slammed the emergency reboot switch. The lights flickered, the core stabilized, and LIRA's voice returned, calm once more. AI integrity restored, ship systems online. Monroe exhaled, exhausted but steady. They had saved the heart of the ship, but their troubles were not over. As they made their way back toward the main bridge, Lyra sent a new alert. An unknown signal had been detected outside the warp stream. A cloaked vessel was trailing them, its energy signature matching rogue Falzer warships. Monroe knew that if the assassin's plan had succeeded, the ship would have been powerless. Now that it had failed, the attackers might strike anyway, using brute force to finish the job. Monroe reached the bridge and issued a priority distress call to Earth Command. The nearest fleet could arrive in 20 minutes, but that was time they didn't have. The cloaked ship had already broken out of stealth, preparing to engage. Weapons were charging, and the valiant Rose was outgunned. Monroe didn't wait. He turned to his crew and ordered an emergency weapons upgrade using the ship's mining equipment to build temporary pulse cannons. It was risky, crude, and completely against standard battle procedures, but it was the only option. While technicians rerouted power and engineers stripped spare parts from the cargo bay, Kalari stepped beside Monroe, watching the enemy ship take form on the screen, a dark, spiked vessel drifting closer, like a predator circling prey. She said nothing at first, just stared at the monitor with narrowed eyes. Then, when the first blast of energy lit up the darkness ahead, she reached over, grabbed the edge of the command console, and looked directly at Monroe. Her voice was calm, but something fierce burned behind her words. "Then let's show them what a human ship can do." The stars lit up with fire as the enemy ship broke formation and launched its first volley toward the Valiant Rose, shaking the entire hull and setting off sparks across the control deck. Warning lights flashed red, and the sound of distant impacts echoed through the ship's frame. But Captain Monroe remained steady, barking orders with clear precision as he rerouted power to the forward shields and activated the makeshift pulse. Cannons they had built using mining lasers and spare reactor coils. The enemy vessel, darker and larger, moved with ruthless speed, its weapon systems calibrated for destruction. But Monroe used every advantage. He had short warp bursts, erratic course changes, and decoy flares, turning the Rose into a target. That was hard to lock onto. Kalari stood by his side, feeding him tactical knowledge about Thalzer warship designs, their targeting weaknesses, and shield delay cycles, allowing Monroe to time his counterattacks perfectly. The two worked in sync, not as captain and guest, but as two commanders fighting for survival. Below deck, the crew scrambled to keep the engines from overheating and patched power lines by hand, while damage control teams sealed breached corridors with emergency bulkheads. Just as it seemed they had found a rhythm, a sudden breach alert rang out from Deck 6. Someone had entered the ship's internal weapon control hub. Monroe instantly knew who it was. The assassin, still alive, had made one last move, hoping to disable their remaining weapons from the inside. Kalari didn't hesitate. She grabbed a blaster from the emergency wall rack and ran with two guards through the smoke-filled hallway, her cloak torn and her crown long gone. She found the assassin mid-sabotage, slicing through the control core, but he turned too late. This time, Kalari didn't wait for her guards or second-guess herself. She fired once, clean and straight, dropping him before he could finish his mission. It was her first kill, not in ceremony or theory, but in real battle, and she stood still for a moment, the weight of it pressing into her chest, before turning back to the fight with new purpose. With systems restored and more pulse blasts striking true, the enemy vessel began to pull back, but Monroe wasn't done yet. He initiated a full broadcast on an open channel, locking eyes with the camera and delivering a message in calm, steady tones. "This ship is armed with a class self-destruct core. Countdown will begin if hostile fire continues. Evacuation of nearby ships is advised." The enemy ship paused, its scans likely picking up the signature of an overloaded fusion core Monroe had rigged just moments earlier with help from the engineering team. It wasn't truly a bomb that couldn't destroy the ship completely, but the signal was convincing enough to make them hesitate. That delay was all he needed. As the enemy began to turn away, Earth's fleet dropped out of warp, a dozen ships, forming a tight formation around the Valiant Rose, their weapons charged and shields up. The attackers, now outnumbered and outmaneuvered, vanished into warp space with a flash, leaving the Rose behind battered but still standing. The crew cheered softly across the comms, relief flooding through tired voices, while Monroe leaned back in his chair, letting the silence settle in for just a second. At the Galactic Summit days later, Kalari stood before the council with her head held high, no longer just a royal figure in danger, but a living symbol of survival and courage. She publicly thanked Earth's crew, naming Monroe and every officer who had risked their life to protect her, and declared that the Thalzer Empire remained united. As a gesture of alliance, the Thalzer granted Earth a permanent seat on Nandazet. The Galactic Council, something no one had expected from such a young race. The announcement rippled across every system, changing how the galaxy viewed humanity, no longer as rookies with potential, but as allies with resolve and grit. When it was time for Kalari to return home, she refused the Grand Royal Cruiser sent for her, instead choosing the Valiant Rose once again. As she stepped aboard, her voice calm and full of quiet confidence, she said, "I only travel human class now." Monroe, standing on the bridge with arms crossed, let out a small laugh and nodded. As she walked past him, heading to the quarters she had grown familiar with, he muttered under his breath, "Aliens are weird, but some of them aren't bad." Outside the viewport, stars shifted as the ship moved forward, carrying a new reputation through space, not just for its victory, but for the human spirit behind it. Across the galaxy, the name the Valiant Rose would become a symbol not of power, but of courage, quick thinking, and loyalty that didn't need titles or bloodlines to matter. Humanity had arrived, not as conquerors, but as protectors. And the stars would remember it.